Good evening. Welcome to another IBIL innovation event. This one is not about detailed rules of law. Enough of that. Not least because they're getting fuzzier and fuzzier. This is about the future of innovation in medicines. Pretty big subject. And we put together a brilliant panel. And my function is only to say this. First of all, turn your phones off. 2, the drinks are just outside at the end. And 3, thank you very much, Colin, for taking charge of the rest of it.
Right, well, thank you, Robin. Thank you very much for that. Now, so the title of this is Patents on Open Innovation, Incentivizing Medicines for the Many. And it's fair to say that speaking as a patent person, and I think there's a lot of patent people in this room, patent people think that it's obvious that the patent system supports innovation. And the medical field is often taken as being the best example of where that is obviously true. But it's obvious that in recent years there have been a lot of challenges to that, many more I think than we used to have, and that's a healthy thing. And the patent system is only worthwhile if it actually does achieve some worthwhile objective like that. The fact that I made my living in it isn't a good enough reason to keep a patent system. You don't need me to go on about the amazing achievements in medical science and technology that we've seen in the last 10, 20, 30, 100 years. They're extraordinary. And it is still happening. I mean, an example that came in front of the Patents Court a couple of years ago that I tried was these extraordinary immunotherapy drugs. I mean, they are really, really something, or I thought they were anyway. As Robin is keen on pointing out, me having decided that patent was valid, they then gave the inventor a Nobel Prize. I like to think he's more proud of the first of those two, but I may be wrong about that. Now, a point which is always made is about the cost of failure of drug development. It's always said it's not right to focus on the cost of developing the drugs, you need to take into account the cost of the failed drugs. And funnily enough, in court yesterday, one Andrew War, Queen's Counsel, is he here? No? Oh, some of you know who he is. He's one of the patents silks. Told me that it cost $500 million per drug to fail. I guess he was talking about failing at phase 2. Some people think it's more than that. Some people think it's less than that. But I don't think anyone disputes that it can cost a great deal of money to test a drug. And if it doesn't work, it will cost you a lot and you don't get anything back. But that's something that might come up a bit later on today. Now, there's a recent WIPO, World Intellectual Property report, that makes a point about the issues raised by recent advances like stem cells, immunotherapy, gene editing, AI. The point they make is about equity and access to medicines. And if I just quote what WIPO said, they said, care is also required to ensure that these new advances do not exacerbate existing healthcare gaps. And I think that's a really important point, that it's all very well having these amazing drugs, but if they only cure rich people, then what is the point? Nevertheless, it's clear that there are challenges to the system, and one of them is the price of medicines and medicinal products, like devices, like stents, and that sort of thing. And it's a problem all over the world. I was at a fascinating IP judges event a couple of weeks ago, and a judge from the Philippines was complaining about the price of drugs in the Philippines. And to my astonishment, the drug she was complaining about was salbutamol. And the reason I'm astonished about that is that, unless I'm missing something, when I was a pupil barrister, it was the trendy drug to fight because it was coming off patent. And I'll give you a clue, that was 29 years ago. So the idea that a drug that's 30 years generic is still at a high price is pretty startling if you think that you think you know how the patent system and the drug generic system actually works. Now, I don't know what the exact position is in the Philippines, maybe all sorts of reasons, but it was certainly pretty startling. And I think one of the problems there was that there's no generic market for that drug in that country. So that's an interesting question. Why is that so? Is it because there are patents on salbutamol? Nah. God, I mean, maybe. Sounds a bit unlikely, but I don't know. I shouldn't say too much about that. Maybe there are. Maybe I'm going to be surprised and someone's found a way of repatenting the prior art. But I don't know. Sounds a bit odd. But what this all leads to is the proposal by one of our political parties in our general election, and I'm quite serious about saying what I'm about to say to you, which is that I am taking, obviously, a neutral stance about anything political, and I will now say that other parties are also available. But in their manifesto, they have stated that we should have a state-funded generic drug company. So that's interesting. And the policy is called Medicines for the Many. And they're saying that drug companies, if they want public research funding, have to make their drugs affordable for all. So because of that, this is a timely occasion to have the debate that we're having this evening about how best to incentivize medical innovation and the role of the patent system. And we've got some really good speakers for you this evening. We've got Dr. Galit-Cohen. Those familiar with patent litigation in the London Patents Court may recognize Galit. One time she was General Counsel for Europe for Teva, and I reckon she is probably the person who signed more witness statements in the Patents Court in the last 10 years than almost anybody else. I've certainly read a number of witness statements of Dr. Gonen-Cohen, and it's a pleasure for me to now be sitting beside her. Now she's at Novartis, who are, of course, a major innovator in the drug market, so she's in a perfect position to give us an industry perspective, and she's going to talk about the way drug development really works these days, not just big pharma, but in a collaboration. Professor Matthew Todd, he's here at UCL. He's the professor of drug discovery. I never thought there was a job like that. It sounds brilliant. Now, his particular interest is in open source drug discovery, and one of his projects is open source malaria. In this open source system, there will be no patents at all, which is fab, which means I can retire and spend more time with my bees. So that's excellent, and that's going to explain all of that to us. And then the third speaker is Professor Adrian Towse. He's the visiting professor at LSE and a director emeritus of the Office of Health Economics at Oxford. Now, it's fair to say that, at least to the patent guys, economists are usually the bad guys who come along and tell us that, ask us hard questions about patents and are skeptical about how the system works and whether it really does what we think. And he's going to ask whether the R&D machine of industry is broken, and if it is, what to do about it. Well, I think that sounds really good. The way it's going to work is that once I've finished, each of the speakers will speak, and after they've each spoken, we'll have a shortish question and answer session. So please, if you've got some questions you want to ask each of them, please put your hand up, and I may ask a question or two, and we'll see how we go. But we'll try and make sure that there's time at the end for a general discussion. So that's the general plan. Finally, just two things before I stop. First of all, I can't help noticing that all this open source collaboration sounds an awful lot like my favorite subject, mobile telephone standards. As the patent nerds will know, I spend a rather inordinate amount of my life worrying about mobile telephone patents and mobile telephone standards. And there is a thing in that world called FRAND. And maybe, God help us, the answer to the problem of collaboration and open source innovation in medicine is to import the horrific FRAND system, I mean the brilliant FRAND system, and put something like it, at least, not the same thing, into medicine. So there's something for you to think about, if you can think of some questions. Now these poor people to my left probably don't even know what FRAND is. So you get a prize if you can explain FRAND in 2 sentences or less. And the final thing I should just mention is Sir Robin and his kind introduction. Now we wouldn't be here without the amazing work that he does in running a public dialogue about intellectual property, and that needs to be recognized. But on a personal note, some of you may know that one R. Jacob was not the most diligent reader of papers when he was at the bar. And I want to share with you my first decent brief that I ever got as a pupil barrister. I was actually Andrew War's pupil, and Mr. War was on holiday somewhere expensive, and I was paid to spend a Sunday helping one R. Jacob QC, write the closing submissions in Bonzel and Intervention, which was a case about angioplasty catheters. I was paid quite a lot because I was paid one of Andrew's brief fees, refreshers, a daily rate of a senior junior barrister at the patent bar, and I was 1 month experience. And I always thought that was pretty great. And then the solicitor told me the truth. He said, the reason, Colin, we paid you was to embarrass Robin into working for the whole day. And that is a true story. And that was my entry into the patent bar. So with that, Galit, do you want to explain your...
Okay, so I'm here to talk about patents and open innovation. I have some slides, not too many, pretty light. So basically, this comes on the back of the political debate in respect of the Labour Party's assertions. And in particular, I chose to focus on two quotes, which you see on the slides. And these are very important because I think that factually, I'm going to try and convince you that these are not correct. So what is said in the quote is basically that the patent system doesn't allow collaboration, that the pharma industry is fragmented, and this is all because of patents. Factually, it's not true. There are many collaborations of many, many types, and I will try to give you a little bit of each type so that you'll have a flavor of what's going on in the pharma industry. In the Deloitte research, it was concluded that there were as many as 9,000 collaborations between 2005 and 2014. And this actually goes back to the 70s. You know, in the 70s, there was an exponential rise in death because of cardiovascular reasons. And then the statins were invented as a collaboration between the academy and the pharma industry. Statins were launched in the 80s. And then the death drop fall dramatically. So today, this is basically how the Cell Journal noted this collaboration contribution. So we go back a couple of years. Now, today, 50% of the medicines which are launched are a result of a collaboration. And you may be surprised to note that actually 8 out of the top 10 bestsellers drugs today were invented as a result of collaboration. And they are not actually only owned by the company who is actively selling them. So factually, the pharmaceutical world is based on collaboration right now, and this is already happening. So I would like to try to touch upon first why drug development requires collaboration, then to talk a little bit about partnerships and external innovation, which types of open innovation we see today, and then I'll conclude with how IP relates to all of this. So why open innovation is a very, very good thing? You know, innovation can happen everywhere. The more you have, the merrier. The more brains you put on a question, the higher is the likelihood that it will be solved. This is a quote by the former head of R&D of Sanofi, which is very convincing. You know, we have tough diseases, we need to cope with them. Collaboration is one of the ways to solve the puzzle. So why collaboration is so important? Let me give you 3 examples. So the first one, you know, medicines of today are more advanced than we used to in the past. We are not seeing only simple chemical molecules. We're seeing cell and gene therapies. So for example, Novartis recently launched Kymriah. This is a cancer drug. This is a cell therapy which was innovated in a collaboration between Novartis and the University of Pennsylvania. These cells, basically T lymphocyte cells, are taken from a patient, are sent to a factory for a couple of weeks, and are reprogrammed to attack cancer drugs. Then these cells are inserted back to the patient and cure his cancer. This is as amazing as it gets. However, since the technologies are so complicated, there are so many platforms involved, this is all new to us. It's not the traditional internal R&D that you can find in most of the pharmas. This is all result of a collaboration. The second reason is pharma companies came up with many, many compounds during the years Many of them are actually not used. And question is whether this can be open to everyone to experiment with. Because sometimes a compound can fit to a specific patient population, other one than the one originally thought of. Sometimes we can find new indication. And therefore, you can see more and more compound libraries are being opened. In the company I work for, we're going to open a library with over 1 million compounds there publicly, so that everyone will have open access to research more on compounds that we have already. So this is important. Knowledge has been accumulated, and maybe we can use it by having more brains examining this knowledge for the sake of our future. And then the third main reason is computer technologies. The combination between data and data scientists, finding algorithms based on data. So we have a lot of data. We had 2 million patients in clinical trials during the last 10 years. We're doing between 400 and 500 clinical trials a year. We have tons of data, CT scans, heart scans, retina scans. Whatever you ask, we have it. But how do you come with insights on the basis of this data? How do you find them? You need data scientists. And traditional pharma's R&Ds, these are not based on data scientists. We really need to work with outside world, with these geeks who just graduated university. They love the data. They can play with it better than we can. And so then we should collaborate in order to come up with insights on the basis of the data and use machine learning and artificial intelligence for the next generation of drugs. And this collaboration is good to everyone. It's good for the academy because usually scientists in the universities, innovation doesn't need it doesn't have a cost, right? Anyone can innovate. However, it's very expensive and it requires a lot of expertise to actually take an innovation and bring it as a medicine to the market. And so collaboration with universities is good for the scientists in the universities to help them to bring their invented drugs to the market many times while they still keep control, allowed to publish their research and what have you. So this collaboration is good for the academy. They also acquire skills of how medicines are developed. They see how it is done in the real world. It's really, really good for the innovators. It's good for pharmas because, again, each pharma is based on its internal R&D, but there is a limit of what the internal R&D can do. And so by more collaborations, the pharma companies are able to move the needle, to launch medicine which will really change the future. And this is all eventually for the benefit of society and patients. So the big winners are the patients who, due to this collaboration, which is already taking place, are getting more medicine and faster. So let me touch upon the types of collaboration. So let's see what we're talking about. So open innovation is a big word. And I try to classify, to explain what open innovation is. And basically, there are 5 main sources for open innovation. First is open source innovation. So this is when you have a free exchange of views by everyone. This is entirely open. Scientists from all over the world exchange views. Pharma companies are involved. Governments are involved. Everyone is involved for the benefit of developing new drug. This is a free exchange. IP is not part of this collaboration. As an example, I chose to mention the Tuberculosis Alliance, which was set up in 2000. And now this alliance has 6 new drugs for tuberculosis in its pipeline, which are going through clinical trials. This is very important for neglected diseases. So when there is a neglected disease, especially in developing countries, sometimes the open source innovation is the best. Pharma companies, this is not the traditional model of pharma companies, but all pharma companies are partners. In the innovation, in the Tuberculosis Alliance that I mentioned, GSK is there, Bayer is there, Novartis is there. The companies do see it as part of fulfilling their social responsibility to help when it comes to research for neglected diseases. The second type is called crowdsourcing. So crowdsourcing is basically when, say, a pharma company has a question, they just shoot it through the internet to the world and see what others can come up with. We in Novartis, we use it for clinical trials, which are decentralized. So we had formed some partnerships with small biotechs that know how to measure digital data taken from patients to basically measure elements at home and reach endpoints without dragging them to the clinical trial centers, which make their life much easier. Another example is a program by Bayer. It is called For Grant, and basically they invite ideas. Twice a year there are submission dates. Basically an idea plus an animal model is accepted, then it is tested, and if it is a good primarily, there is some funding, and if it is even better, then at some point a more solid partnership is formed. So basically all the scientist community is invited to participate. The third type is what we call PPP. This is the public-private partnership. And here we talk about business venture, usually between governments and the pharma industry. In Europe, we have the IMI, and this is a partnership between the European Parliament and the European pharma industry. IMI is not a completely open organization. The projects are actually confidential to the participants, but the collaboration is there, and there is a lot of advancement there in questions which are shared by multiple pharma companies. In Europe, we have hundreds of projects in IMI. For example, again, how to measure the way that patient walks remotely to check how is he doing on his multiple sclerosis medication, for example, or questions about biomarkers, or question about niche indications. So in the IMI, typically, it's not directly related to the business of pharmaceutical companies, but to the specific business, but it makes us all better. It responds together on questions which are interesting to everyone. And then the fourth type is what we call innovation centers. Is basically when a pharma company has a collaboration agreement with a preferred university, and each company chooses whatever works best in terms of pipeline or business plans or patient needs in a specific area. And there, it's a truly genuine collaboration where it's really working together between the academy scientists and the scientists within the company. So we in Novartis, we have Innovation Center in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where the university scientists can come to campus, can experiment in the lab, they get funding, they are exposed to the processes that we have to development drug. We even have a course to onboard new scientists who come to the company, and the scientists from the academy are allowed and invited to participate. And we have a whole team force that deals only with this collaboration. And this has proven very, very good, working together, and again, more ideas are coming, and some are going nowhere, some are further developed to become drugs. And then the fifth type is collaborations. We have a lot of collaborations with biotechs, with other pharmas, with the academy to develop together, to see who can bring what to the table so that we come up with the best medicines eventually, which would be launched in the fastest way for patients. And here I wanted to give an example of a genetic therapy. So genetic therapy, which we launched earlier this year, is super complicated, so it's not a chemical molecule. So many participants should be involved in the manufacturing process, purification process, what have you. We in Novartis developed a genetic therapy in our internal R&D. We were slightly behind others, another company who is called Avexis, which developed a genetic therapy working 25 years on a specific disease in Chicago, Illinois. The idea originally actually came from French scientists, then it went to the US, it went back to Slovenia to another company to develop the specific purification which is required to the manufacturer, and then it came to Novartis, and now it's a huge collaboration between multiple players, and the drug was launched earlier this year in the US. Let me tell you a little bit about the drug so that you get a sense of how complicated it is. So SMA, spinal muscular atrophy, is a devastating disease. Basically, children are born with a modified gene which doesn't allow their nerve cells to produce a specific protein which is required to their motor function. And they are born quite normal, but then gradually they lose their motor control until most of them die by the age of 2. The genetic therapy is basically, you cure the children by 1 injection. So I wanted to show you a very short clip on this specific drug.
Muscular atrophy, or SMA type 1, is the leading genetic cause of death for infants today. A devastating fact this family knows all too well.
Our first daughter, she was diagnosed with SMA type 1 at 6 months of age, and she passed away at 15 months old.
This is a disease that is devastating for infants. A large percentage of patients die before 1 year of age, but 95+% are gone, unfortunately, by age 2.
SMA rapidly robs babies of their ability to move, talk, swallow, and eventually breathe. When Milan and his wife Elena found out they were pregnant with their second child, Evelyn, they prayed for a healthy baby. Unfortunately, that was not the case.
When she was born, and the results came back, and found out she was positive for SMA type 1. And we both kind of just broke down. We found out about the clinical trial here at Nationwide Children's Hospital.
This is really the first time that we've been able to apply gene therapy to any neuromuscular disease.
Today was a very special day for Evelyn. She was given genetic therapy for her missing SMN gene.
Babies with SMA are missing a gene vital for development. Through a one-time injection, gene therapy replaces this missing gene. For Evelyn, this gene therapy worked.
We start seeing changes as early as 2 months after treatment.
She started to push, and she started to get more active, holding her head up. And a little after 3-4 months, she rolled over on her own.
Now 3-year-old Evelyn challenges Dr. Mendel to a dance-off at her annual follow-up appointment.
She comes back after 3 years and she runs up to me and hugs me and says, "Dr. Mendel, I love you."
I forget that she has SMA. This is a healthy girl and she does everything that a normal 3-year-old child would do.
Something like that has never been achieved before.
With our first daughter, it was just devastating to lose a child. You lose all dreams you had for their future. And now we can actually save for college.
So this is collaboration at its best, and nobody can do it without collaborating. This is so complicated and so life-changing that this is a direct result of what we do. Let me go to IP. So what about IP? We have IP, we have collaborations already, this is ongoing. How important is IP for collaborations? I say IP is critical for collaborations. Not only I say it, also the Wall Street Journal says it as well. So IP is fundamental. The reason IP is so important, IP assigns value and ownership in a transparent way. And IP creates standards for deals. And basically they make market deals possible and economically efficient. And patents do it already. Patents are not always owned by pharmas. Patents many times are owned by universities. And for them, also the patents are very important. You know, the patent is going to expire 20 years from its filing. University who files a patent and then they have a molecule and an idea and they don't know what to do with it, it's a race. They need an expert, a pharma company that will help them, and maybe other participants that will help them to actually bring the drug to market. And this helps patients as well because it's quicker. So patents are important. There are obviously challenges. So there are upsides and challenges. One of the challenge is control. How do you do a deal? How do you assign control? Usually there are various participants, various patents, who gets what, how the pie is shared. You know, it's a challenge, but it's not a challenge that we cannot solve. Another challenge is when you work with the academy, they want to publish, and sometimes it affects patentability. Also here, it's a challenge that we can solve. We can see whatever we published, we can see how we file patent application before we publish. It can all be solved with a diligent process and in place. Now, the patent system is not perfect. I don't think anyone claims it is perfect. It is especially not perfect in neglected areas. And here we saw governments intervening. And I think when the patent system is not perfect, it's good that governments intervene. And it's good that there are prices, subsidies, open source innovation and collaboration for neglected areas and for cases where the patent system fails. However, as a general rule, I think the patent system is good. It enables deals. And think what would happen without it. So who would decide what is best? Say the regulator decides what is best. So, it's kind of an arbitrary decision. Some say that innovation will grow if the regulator actually is the one deciding on it. But even if the regulator decides on it, how in the end it can be economically efficient? And if it is not economically efficient, how can it be sustainable in the end? And health is too important to mess around with. So here's my plea to you. Just my last example is actually coming from India and China, and this kind of proves what I'm trying to say. So in India and China, before 2005, before India and China accepted TRIPS or decided to be compliant with TRIPS, there were only generics there. There was no innovation there, no R&D there. Now, since 2005, you see more international pharma companies investing in R&D in China and in India after they have stronger IP system. You see international companies working with local Chinese company on innovation. You see more and more innovation coming to China and India and then to the world on the back of the IP system. And so I think that's it for me. Okay. Thank you all very much.
Well, Galit, thank you very much indeed, and that was quite a stunning video, quite moving. What I'm going to do instead of giving you all a chance to ask Galit some questions, because I think actually Matt's going to answer some of the points that Galit's put to us. I think we'll go straight into Matt's presentation about open source innovation, and then we'll have more time at the end. So don't forget the questions you were going to ask.
Okay, I will put this on just to make sure you can hear me. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to come and speak. I guess the management summary of my presentation is that for a number of reasons, there is a need for an alternative system to the one that we currently have. There is at the moment rather a lack of concrete proposals about how we might do that. A lot of discussion about what we need, but not many concrete proposals. I'd like to try and convince you of the enormous benefits of working in a more open way. So those are the three things I think I'm going to try and say. The caveat to everything I'm about to say is that it depends on the disease you're talking about. Okay, so often the general remarks that we have really are not applicable across diseases from cancer through to neglected tropical diseases. So we do have to be a little bit careful of that. The terminology I have to get established at the outset is about this idea of open source, because there's a lot of confusion about what that means. The two extremes of collaboration, I guess, are things that we're familiar with. So we know about working behind closed doors with a group of people who are experts. And we know also about working in a much more unstructured way where anybody can criticize us and input. And we see these things a lot around us. I mean, we see them as children when we play. Sometimes we want something for ourselves, and sometimes we're happy for people to come along and help us out. These are the kind of two extremes, a closed system and an open system. And this is known in software as the cathedral and the bazaar. A cathedral being something built by trained artisans in a pyramid system where people are highly trained. And the bazaar being the market being somewhere which is a space where everyone can come along and do whatever they want. And we know about these things in non-software terms. because we know about the Britannica, which is a cathedral construction, versus Wikipedia, which is the bizarre construction. So the Britannica is something which was constructed by highly trained people in a closed system, and Wikipedia is something which is constructed very openly. And you or I can change it today. Can't change Britannica, can change Wikipedia. Fundamentally different constructions, but both resulting in extremely important things. Half of us in the room have iPhones, and those run with iOS, which is a proprietary product, closed system. Half of us have Android phones run with the Android operating system, which is essentially, unless there are any software geeks in the audience, is open source. So you or I can change it. So the distinction between open innovation and open source is quite important, because open source is something that you or I can change. We have access to everything, and we have freedom to operate. Okay, that's not necessarily the case with lots of the open innovation things we often hear about. Open source is not something which is done by teenagers in their bedrooms. It is often leading to market-leading products, such as Firefox and Chrome, and essentially all of the software that underpins the internet is constructed and built on open source software. This is just a diagram of venture capital, so venture capital investment in open source software companies in the last 30 years. Over $10 billion of venture capital money. So not public or philanthropic money, but venture capital money. The amount of money that goes into developing these things is really very significant. So this is not a niche area. It often results in market-leading things. So I've been interested for a long time in whether we can apply the same ideas behind open source software. Everybody has access to everything. Anybody can participate and contribute meaningfully to other things, to physical things, like drugs or tanks or my day job, catalysts industrially, or trainers or whatever you want. Can the same principles of open, unstructured, freedom to operate collaboration result in leading things like this? And I was interested in these things, and because I'm a chemist, I chose drugs because I thought that was the hard one. Because that's an area where we normally associate a very stringent need for secrecy. So I was interested in that principle about whether we could apply an open approach to the discovery of new medicines, in part because as I looked around, I saw that essentially all of the medicines that we take and receive are developed with one model, which is the traditional model we have, involving secrecy, patents, the usual process. And I was intrigued by that and think it's very suspicious when all the things you see are developed with one approach. You think, well, shouldn't there be an alternative? What about a competition for the way in which we should do this? So over the last few years, I've been running several open source drug discovery projects using these 6 laws, which were formed after the first project we did with WHO on the world's most widely used antiparasitic, which we improved with an open source approach. The first 3 are the most important, so all data are open and all the ideas are shared. Anyone can take part at any level and no patents. The reason why the patent is excluded is in part because everything is put online in real time. So it's immediate public disclosure of everything. And that third law just clarifies that there will be no attempt to keep things back. There's no outsiders, right? Everyone's an insider. The others are just ways of behaving, which are also very important, but maybe it's slightly less important than the first 3 laws. So we applied these in a project called Open Source Malaria, and have cloned it for things in TB and antifungals as well. So the same basic idea. And what does it mean? Well, it means that the lab notebooks that every scientist uses, rather than being on a piece of paper on a bench, and you write it in with a pen, right, like Leonardo da Vinci did, you have something online and electronic so that everybody can see every experiment. And we say that that's important so that people can see what we're doing. It's actually not. It's important so that in 10 years, machines will be able to digest what we've done, but that's a separate story. The most important thing is that everything is shared in real time. We discuss things online as well, openly, so it's clear what we're going to do, not just what we have done. The data are machine readable in various spreadsheets. Social media takes care of community operations. And what this has resulted in is many people participating voluntarily and spontaneously, in much the same way you see for Wikipedia. So from student cohorts, including school children, through to seasoned pharmaceutical executives. This approach is absolutely inclusive of the pharmaceutical industry. Some of the most valuable inputs, spontaneously and free, that we get are from the pharma industry. including this guy, Scott Obach from Pfizer, but also Novartis, GSK. All these companies contribute spontaneously to these projects. Okay, so that's what we've been doing. One of the, as you'll notice in the areas that I just mentioned, many of these are in infectious diseases. Something I would love to do, which is what I'm working on now, is applying the same idea to the discovery and development of new antibiotics, because it's another area where there is obviously a problem. Jeremy Farrar, head of Wellcome, said this amazing thing: there is no viable path for new drugs, antibiotics, however valuable they are to society. An extraordinary thing for him to say. But certainly an area that we want to try and apply this method to see if it can break a deadlock that we appear to currently have. If you're not familiar with the problem, it's known as the fire extinguisher problem, that if you develop a new antibiotic, the last thing you want to do is use it, because as soon as you do that, resistance begins to develop. So it's like a fire extinguisher. You want it on the wall, but you never want to have to use it. And this creates all kinds of problems for the economics of antibiotics. The idea, the issue I'm trying to face, I guess, is whether or not we can move from these pilot projects that we've been running with hundreds of participants, but still essentially pilot projects, to something which has a more sustainable financial model, right? And how might you do that? So the current problem that we have, I guess, is that we know that there's a good way of working, which is this highly collaborative, unstructured way where anybody can participate. And yet, at the moment, we have this problem that you can't square that with the current system we have, which requires patent protection, requires some secrecy, requires ownership of IP. How do you do that? What you really want, I guess, in theory, would be a system where you can work in this very unstructured way, develop a medicine, show it works and is effective, which I think is something Adrian's going to talk about, show it actually works and is effective, and then after the fact, get some kind of financial reward back to the people who did it. Maybe make your money back, perhaps. Now that seems hopelessly naive, right? That would solve a lot of things, and it seems like, okay, well, maybe next time it's your birthday we can have this, but this isn't going to work. It turns out we don't need to wish for it. It exists already, and we're not using it. So there are two ways of earning IP. One is the patent system, and the other is regulatory exclusivity arrangements that you get by taking the medicine through clinical trials to market. If you do that, if you take a medicine through, and it depends on the disease again, it depends on the indication, it depends on a bunch of different things, the jurisdictions. If you take a medicine through to market, you can, at that point, be granted a period of exclusivity as a reward for doing that, which is a piece of paper from the government that says, well done, you've done this, now you're free to set the price of this medicine for a period of time at whatever you want. This then allows you to get money back, completely independent of the patent system. So what that means is you can work in this open way without keeping things back, and yet at the end you still have ownership of something. Very interesting. So this has been discussed for a few years. I've been talking about it for a few years. And Al Edwards and his team at the SGC and his collaborators at a company called M4K Pharma recently published this very nice article at the bottom of that slide there, which goes through that model. In that paper, there's a very interesting table with a bunch of medicines that are unpatented, but are generating revenue for the associated company through regulatory data exclusivity arrangements. This table goes way beyond the bottom of this slide, by the way. So it's not unprecedented. It will be extremely useful to be able to use this as a way of doing R&D for things like new antibiotics and still having control of a revenue stream at the end. So that's quite exciting. So the last slide here is that, ironically, years ago, when I thought, well, let's try the open source thing on the hard thing, which I thought was the medicines, turns out that because there are existing regulatory arrangements which are set in stone and gifted by regulatory agencies, it turns out that maybe I chose the easy case, which is medicines.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Take this thing.
Adrian, do you want to tell us why the R&D machine in industry is broken?
Thank you. Sorry, let me just set the timer. So just before I start, so the Office of Health Economics is not at Oxford University. I do have a visiting post at Oxford, but the Office of Health Economics is just down the road in Victoria. We're research and consulting group. We're legally a charity. We're owned by the ABPI, the UK pharmaceutical industry, who give us a research grant, but we actually operate independently of them, and most of our income comes from other work. So, what I want to essentially argue in the next 10 minutes is, well, first of all, do we have a problem? Some of my thoughts on open science, but in essence what I want to argue is there are some issues in the innovation process, but a lot of the issues are actually to do with failures on the demand side, not on the supply side. And so I want to give you some examples of ways in which the demand side can be sorted out. These are busy slides, so I'm just going to highlight a couple of points and move on. But for me, the science isn't broken, and you heard a very good example of that. We're getting innovation. The real issue or concern of payers is how much it's costing them. A decade ago, they were concerned they weren't getting it. Now the issue is that it costs too much. The standard estimate, Demasi et al., is $2.6 to $3 billion of the cost of getting a new drug to market, taking account of failures. There are lower estimates and lots of arguments about it. There's been a general thought that certainly in areas like oncology, where we're getting a lot of new innovation, clinical trial numbers tend to be quite low. There's fast-track regulation processes, so maybe costs should be lower. But again, Demasi presented a couple of conferences, a paper coming out that says, well, the problem is that for each indication, small number of patients, but actually for any molecule to make money, you have quite a number of indications. So you add the patient numbers up, and suddenly the R&D costs start going up. The critical issue, I think, is R&D costs per patient treated is almost certainly rising. So we do have real increases in R&D costs. What can we do about it? Well, one argument has been that this fast-track access that regulators are giving after phase 2 or a variety or with fewer patients is one way of reducing costs. The problem is that payers still want evidence. So all we're doing is shifting the data collection and more studies into the post-launch period. Can we revolutionize R&D costs? Well, one way is through IT. So if we could conduct or recruit patients for clinical trials, conduct clinical trials, once we'd randomized, we just followed their progress through their routine medical records. That would transform our ability to collect data. But that presupposes that A, we have electronic medical records, and B, they actually collect the information about patients that we're really interested in. And unfortunately, in most healthcare systems are not there yet. So therefore, we get into other sorts of issues around patent pools, open innovation, open source innovation. And I just want to give you one example here. This is a paper by Chas Bountra, who we have a joint project through the Oxford Martin School. We're working together because he and I have different views about the role of patents, and we're hoping by pooling our thinking we can come out with ways in which sort of open science and related approaches can work. His paper is essentially saying, look, we've got a lack of understanding of key diseases, we've got very high failure rates at early stages of development. So therefore, sharing data and know-how would do two things. One, it would reduce duplication, and secondly, it would increase our overall knowledge and therefore our ability to tackle diseases. And the key point is that IP leads to secrecy. In other words, the innovation process, in Chaz's view, is characterized by people working in parallel in private and not knowing what each other are doing, and the end process is significant amounts of duplication and a lack of learning that would come from sharing knowledge. And he recommends that the state push the threshold of pre-competitive and open source drug development down the development pathway. I'll come back to that point. So my kind of comments and conversations I've had with Chaz would be, okay, but I think the evidence is that successful companies both patent and publish. So, and the reason they do that is because their leading scientists need to be part of the academic debate around what's happening in a disease area, as well as internal drug developers. Yes, there are key gains to be had from pre-competitive collaborations, and I think we may need competition authorities to think more broadly about what is the boundary between a pre-competitive activity and a competitive activity. But I think we can form innovation clubs in disease areas. My instinctive model is that companies and others form voluntary clubs where they're sharing knowledge, but they're keeping their IP. So the learning is what each other are doing, so you avoid sinking dry holes because you know that somebody else in the club has already been there or somewhere very near, so you think it's just not worth going down that route. And of course, if you're sharing knowledge, then you're increasing your overall understanding of what's happening in a disease area. So I think these sorts of things that Chaz is talking about are important, but I think they can be done in a way that preserves IP. I think it makes more sense to have effective pull incentives. I think my fundamental point is I don't think governments and health systems should pay for effort. In other words, they shouldn't be rewarding academics because they're working hard in a particular disease area, or indeed a company because it's working hard in a particular disease area. They should reward when actually something is delivered that is going to be useful to the health system because it's going to treat patients. So so I think therefore we need to separate demand side failures where we don't, for various reasons, we don't have a market that's pulling through innovation from the R&D efficiency issues, which I think are genuine and where we do need to think about what we do. There are, again, another strong argument which Mariana Mazzucato, amongst others, have made is that a lot of R&D effort is publicly funded, and A, that's a good thing, which I agree with, and B, though that there's not recognition in the private sector and a reward mechanism that enables the public sector to get a return when that R&D is used. And I think the solution is tech transfer deals, Bayh-Dole type legislation, mechanisms that ensure that when the private sector is picking something up that the public sector has essentially generated, then as appropriate, some sort of reward and royalties are appropriately paid. So this is a busy slide which I don't have time to go through in detail, so I'll just focus on the first bullet point here. So this is work that I've done with Patricia Danson at the Wharton School, and in a sense the starting point is, well, how should a market work where there aren't money problems? I would say, let's think of the UK, and clearly we think of the UK NHS as always having money problems. But if we think about a high-income country health system, how do they pay for a drug? How do they know how much they should be paying for a drug? And the simple answer is that the optimal price depends on payers unilaterally setting like an incremental cost effectiveness threshold. So NICE has one of 20 to 30,000 per QALY. QALY is the measure of health gain. For end-of-life cancer drugs, it's 50,000. For ultra-orphans, it's 100,000 plus. So if essentially the health system says, what our patients, our citizens say is this is how much we are prepared to pay for health gain, a unit of health gain, then the pharmaceutical company knows what it's aiming at. That's the price that it can set and get that product used for those patients in that country. And each high-income country will have a different threshold. Overall, that sends the right signals to a pharmaceutical company about the sorts of returns they will get if they develop a product in a particular disease area that delivers a certain amount of health gain. So let's think just very quickly 3 examples where for some reason that market pull is not working. The first is the Health Impact Fund proposal by Aidan Hollis and colleagues in Canada. And this would be in effect, there'd be an innovation in global health, would have a donor-funded pot of money. It would raise that from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Department for International Development, a variety of international donors would create a pot. Companies would then compete in developing new technologies, drugs and other technologies for prizes, i.e. some of that share of that pot. They get a share of that pot in relation proportional to the health impact of the project. There'd be an expert assessment of what the value gain would be. In low-income countries, we typically talk about DALYs rather than QALYs, disability-adjusted life year. We're still talking about what's the health gain for the patients. So the prize, the reward for R&D would come through the prize, and then the product itself would be sold at manufacturing cost. So you'd separate, and you'd have a different way of rewarding the company. There are no IP implications from that. Second example where it's not working, then we've already heard from Matthew some of the issues. There's I think two problems. So one is the problem that he identified with his fire extinguisher example, that actually the big problem is if we develop a fantastic new antibiotic, we want to use it as little as possible, and only on those patients who have failed on every other antibiotic. So the whole point is to preserve it. As soon as we start using it, resistance starts building up to our super new product. But there's another problem as well, which is that most antibiotics are old generics. Their prices are low. So even if you were using the new drug a lot, then the price would be so low and the company wouldn't get a return. So, and why is that happening? The fundamental problem is, in economics jargon, there's an externality that is not caught in our value assessment mechanisms, whether it's NICE or whoever is doing that. So what we do in HTA is we look at the health gain for the individual patient. For a new antibiotic, the health gain, most of the health gain is not the individual patient who's treated, it's the fact that we stop the transmission to lots of other patients. So the health gain is actually dissipated somewhere else. If you think about it, it's more like the analogy with vaccines, where you have a herd immunity effect. It's important you get your treatment levels up, because that's then protecting the whole population, including people who have not been vaccinated. So we have a problem with our value assessment, and we have a problem with our fire extinguisher, the fact that when we have a new antibiotic, we don't want to use it. So the net result of that is that we're not getting new antibiotics through the private sector, because the potential revenues are not great. How can we solve that? Well, we published a report a couple of months ago with money from the Wellcome Trust, which connects with the comments that Matthew had on his. I have a more benign view of Jeremy Farrar perhaps than Matthew does, where we were looking at addressing one of those issues, the HTA issue, but also the need to delink payments from volume. In other words, the company needs to get to be rewarded for producing the fire extinguisher. If it only gets rewarded every time the fire extinguisher gets used, then it's not going to develop the fire extinguisher. It's as simple as that. So there are different ways in which that can be done. One of the ways that the UK is currently experimenting with and working on is what I've called here an availability contract. So NICE and NHS England are looking at a model where there'd be a new valuation method for trying to identify those externalities, and then companies would be paid on a monthly basis for having those drugs available on the basis of what the expected value would be. Early stages and lots of issues, but I think a potential way forward. Final one is new drugs for TB. This is work we've done with the Centre for Global Development. We published a blueprint a few months ago, and we're about we published our final report early next year. This is work that's funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and we call this a market-driven, value-based advance commitment, MVAC, for TB. And the critical point, and I take completely the points we've had about neglected tropical diseases, low-income countries, an issue you have to have donor intervention to make it work. But if you look at TB, then most TB occurs in BRICS countries, middle-income countries, who are actually increasingly spending more resources, domestic resources, on addressing health issues. So what we recommended is something that builds on an earlier donor-based proposal, something called an advanced market commitment for pneumococcal vaccine, where a group of global donors, including DFID and the Gates Foundation, said effectively, if companies develop or make available a pneumococcal vaccine in low-income countries to Gavi, then we will guarantee a top-up price over and above manufacturing that will reward them for the additional effort that they've put in. what we proposed is that the price should be as happens in the UK. You make a proposal to NICE based on your health gain. The price that you can charge is based on health gain. If we look at the potential value in terms of DALYs averted and health system costs averted of a TB treatment, we base that on the budgets, the health budgets that BRICS countries have. Then there are so many patients in these countries, you actually come up with a sum of money that will provide a return to pharmaceutical companies on a commercial basis. The big issue, and in a sense, the other part of the crucial part of the failure, is that one of the reasons that multinationals are skeptical about developing new products that will only be sold in India, South Africa, Russia, and China, is that they're skeptical about opportunistic behavior, which means once those products are developed, then their price will be beaten down on the basis that you have nowhere else to sell those products. So why don't you just give them to us at manufacturing price? And the critical point we're putting in here is that the payments will be guaranteed by multilateral development banks such as the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank. So in other words, there will be a pre-contractual commitment. If you develop the product that delivers this target product profile, we will guarantee this price and this volume. And in effect, the World Bank says, and if for any reason the government doesn't do that, then we will pay the manufacturer and effectively take ownership of the product. So there's effectively a guarantee that would support that. So, concluding thoughts. We need to separate, I think, demand-side failure from R&D efficiency issues. They're both extremely important, but I think they're separate and require different approaches. It's not clear to me that IP is a barrier to tackling either. We can push all of the way, but I'm not convinced that governments and donors shelling out at each stage for effort is necessarily the way forward. I think it's better to think about how we pay for success. And I think that's going to be more efficient. There is a danger in this debate of mixing the positive and the normative. There's always an instinct on people when we get involved in debates around IP that people step over the line from making positive, empirically evidence-based statements into normative views about what they particularly prefer. And I may well be guilty of this in some respects, but I think it's something that we need to try and keep separate. Respect, we all have opinions, but also we have evidence as well, and ultimately we have an objective of trying to improve the health of our populations around the world. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Well, blimey, thank you very much, Adrian. So we've got Galit telling us that we need intellectual property to facilitate innovation, given how complicated modern technology and modern science is becoming. But she was accepting that there might be problems for some neglected diseases. We've got Matt telling us to do open source work for some drugs and to forget about patents and use data exclusivity instead. I must say, I wonder if that's just a patent by another name, but that's a question maybe we can think about. And we've got Adrian telling us that we shouldn't be mixing the positive and the normative. And that scares the hell out of me because I don't really know what it means. But in addition, and what he did explain is, which I did understand, is the demand side failures should be separated from R&D, and I do see the point he's making there, and that we should have a system for paying for success. And so he's describing what is actually a very old idea, the idea of having a prize system. And although his first one was a prize system, actually I think it's fair to say, to some extent, his third one is a kind of a prize system as well, really. And many of you will know, I guess, the great story about the Board of Longitude, which was an attempt to foster innovation using a prize system. Now, that was a question, did it work or not? Did Mr. Harrison, who made those clocks, which allowed you to work out your longitude before we had sat-nav and GPS and decent other ways of doing it, did that happen because of the prize system? And there was huge disputes between Mr. Harrison and the Board of Longitude. He didn't think they paid in the prize that they owed him. So that's an interesting story and an old song. Well, there you have it. I could ask them some questions, but I'd much rather you did that.